Hiya, I'm Whisper, and let's talk about some more advanced assassination concepts. As you start to get better with any class or spec, you'll begin to notice that there's lots of terms, or just smaller bits of knowledge that aren't really well explained. Assassination is no different, and being a dot spec, some of these are actually really important. So by the end of the video, you should know basically all there is to know about pandemic, pooling, what saturation is, and why uptime is important. Pandemic is a really big knowledge check for a lot of people new to a spec that has longer duration effects like bleeds. It's not actually written anywhere in game, and it's just kind of a hidden game mechanic that people have to learn for themselves. The problem it solves is pretty simple. If you have a bleed effect like Garrote, for example, it lasts 18 seconds. Without knowing anything about Pandemic, this means you would have to refresh the Garrote every 18 seconds on the dot. Any sooner and you're refreshing it early, wasting the last bit of the bleed. Any later, and the bleed drops off the target, which is wasting uptime. The solution to this issue is Pandemic, and it's named after a Warlock passive from Mists of Pandaria, which said, when refreshing your periodic damage effects, duration remaining on the previous effect is added to the new one, up to a maximum of 50% the base duration. In Warlords of Draenor, this effect was turned into a baseline mechanic across the entire game, with a 30% maximum instead. The Pandemic effect allows you to refresh your bleeds before they time out, giving you a window of time to ensure their uptime, rather than having to refresh perfectly with 0 seconds remaining. There are some quirks we need to talk about though, and of course that means an example. Garrote is the easiest of the bunch to understand, so let's take a second and check the logic for Garrote specifically. It's an 18-second long bleed, and Pandemic is duration remaining is added to the new one up to a maximum of 30% the base duration. So 30% of 18 seconds is 5.4 seconds, which brings our maximum duration on Garrote to 23.4 seconds. And in game, we can just hit a dummy and yep, that's 23 seconds. Any time within this 5.4 second window is net neutral on your DPS. If you refresh with 5 seconds remaining, you have 13 seconds worth of Garrote from the first cast, and you're now getting 23 seconds from the second one. Together that adds up to 36 seconds, which would be the full duration of the 2 Garrotes you cast. If instead you refreshed with 1 second remaining, then you got 17 seconds worth of Garrote from the first cast, and an additional 19 seconds from the second cast. That again adds up to 36 seconds, which would be the full duration of the 2 Garrotes. This gives you a great deal of control over when you'll be refreshing your bleeds, but it has a bit of an ugly side to it as well. The wording specifically says duration remaining on the previous effect. This is where the confusing part starts. Take for example Improved Garrote. When you cast a Garrote from stealth, the entire Garrote does increase damage. But that's where the issue comes in. If you refresh this empowered Garrote during your Pandemic with a normal Garrote, the duration might transfer over, but the damage does not. The damage is always calculated from the new application. As you might be suspecting, this means that for the maximum damage, we want to let empowered Garrotes expired fully before using a normal Garrote. But again, the complications aren't done. What if you had an empowered Garrote in Pandemic, and you went to refresh it with an empowered Garrote? Well, in that case, it would be fine. The damage isn't changing from the first one to the second one, and the duration is transferred. Going from a normal Garrote to an empowered Garrote is even better than that. You get all the extra duration with the empowered damage. Playing around this Pandemic effect used to be a huge gameplay feature. As of this video in 10.1.5, playing around the empowered Garrote uptime is relevant with Sepsis, which allows you to abuse this Pandemic feature and extend empowered Garrotes for upwards of 30 seconds. Pooling is another term you might hear a lot when talking about Assassination Rogue. This used to be a lot more prevalent than it is currently in Dragonflight, but it is something to always consider if you're trying to play optimally, or just trying to deepen your understanding of the spec in the game. Pooling is the act of saving resources from a point of low impact for a point of high impact. Some common examples of this for Assassination right now are maximizing Envenom and Elaborate planning uptime, as well as maximizing the effects of your cooldowns like Shiv. I want to reiterate that this is only a very minor increase in 10.1.5. and often is even completely ignored without major downsides. But knowledge of pooling is vital if a tier set or balancing change to the spec ever makes it relevant again. Let's go over the two examples from earlier in a little bit more depth to understand what pooling is and how to do it effectively. Pooling for Shiv is a great example. If Assassination was a little slower than it is currently, you would most likely run out of energy towards the end of your Shiv window and possibly miss a cast because of it. In this case, you would want to pool energy or sit on a reserve of energy in anticipation of an upcoming Shiv. When you then cast Shiv, you would use this reserved or pooled energy during that window, which would be a more efficient use than just spamming it away otherwise. Pooling for Envenom or elaborate planning uptime is also a great example, but from a different angle. Let's say that you just cast a Rupture and got the elaborate planning buff. You then mutilate twice, get back to 5 combo points, and you could Envenom right away. But you still have 2 seconds left on elaborate planning. Instead of slamming the Envenom, you can simply wait to cast it until the elaborate planning buff is about to drop, and then cast the Envenom. This gives you an extra seconds or so on the buff, and you have more energy to work with when building towards the next finisher, since you just waited. To be clear, this is only a gain if you're not wasting any resources in the process. Pooling energy for Shiv is pointless if you're already at max energy and letting the additional energy go to waste. If you're sitting at 5 combo points and waiting for elaborate planning uptime, you shouldn't use another mutilate and waste those combo points. Remember, pooling is the act of saving resources from a point of low impact for a point of high impact. It's not an excuse to waste resources. Alongside pooling energy, there's also a term many people are unfamiliar with for Assassination specifically, and that's the concept of saturation. Usually this is referring to energy saturation, but it could also be an uptime on a buff or even just global cooldowns. The saturation point is a type of breakpoint where you no longer gain any major benefits from something. Mythic Plus is a great place to see this happen with regards to energy saturation. If you've watched the basics video, you might remember that Venomous Wounds is a huge driving factor for energy regeneration, especially in AoE. But there will come a point where you have so many Garrotes and Ruptures out in AoE that you cannot spend the energy fast enough and end up wasting some. If you don't have enough energy, you're starving, but if you have too much, you're oversaturated. The equilibrium point right in the middle where you have just enough energy to fill every GCD with an ability is the saturation point. Because of our bleeds speeding up with haste, this point is very slightly different for everyone depending on your gear or even your talents that affect energy gain. But there should always be a general guideline to follow. As of right now, the saturation point in AoE ends up being at about 5 or 6 bleeds. Similarly, saturation can occur on buffs like Envenom. In single target right now, Envenom has 100% uptime, which would mean that the buff is considered saturated. The last thing I want to talk about is uptime. Uptime is fundamentally misunderstood by a lot of players when referring to Assassination, or dot specs in general. The argument you'll often see is, well, it has bleeds, so it doesn't need uptime on a target. And while this is technically true, it will definitely lose less than other rogue specs. I think it's very overblown. My Mythic Kazara, for example, had Garrote, Rupture, and the dot from Deadly Poison doing a combined 24% of my damage, while Rupture on a similar subtlety log was only doing about 7% of their damage. That is a measurable difference, but it still means that over 75% of my damage requires me to be hitting a boss. I would argue that given how large of a portion of our damage still requires hitting the boss, the best way to play around downtime is to minimize it, rather than trying to increase your damage during that time. Obviously having dots ticking during downtime is good, but we want to get in situations where we're still able to hit the boss instead of being off the boss. The easiest way is making sure you're actually using Sprint and Shadow Step effectively to get around during a boss fight. With a talent reducing Sprint's cooldown to 1 minute and 2 charges of Shadow Step, you can use these well to your advantage. This is mostly just a PSA of use your abilities, they're meant to be used. But I think something very often overlooked is using Shadow Steps on allies to dodge, rather than simply using it on enemies to get back in. You can stay on the target for a lot longer using a well-timed Shadow Step both in and out of the boss, and maintaining a high uptime on a target is often overlooked as an important method to increase your damage. And that's it! All the intermediate concepts to understand when playing Assassination Rogue. The uptime one is more of an everyone problem, but it's still just as important to talk about as any other topic. 10.2 PTR is coming out soon, and I'm super excited for it. I hope you guys stick around for all the new stuff, and I hope it helped.